Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is a leading scholar on extremism, radicalization, and polarization. And she has a brand new book out, Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. And this covers the massive uptick in misogyny and how this is tied to violent extremism throughout the West. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Susan. Really happy to be in conversation about this.
Great. Well, I know your book, Man Up, just came out on September 16th last
Yeah.
week. So, can you talk with us about why you decided to write this book now?
Yeah, I start the book in many ways with an apology to the field for not doing it sooner, because I have been interviewing boys and men in and around violent scenes my whole life, my whole career. I've written other books before on far right extremism and on youth radicalization. And it was staring me right in the face the whole time. And I think that's what I've heard from other scholars in the field now who have read it, who've said the same thing. Like it's right there. It's hidden in plain sight. And it started to become more and more obvious to me that we were not paying attention to it. And I think the thing that tipped the scale for me was the kidnapping and execution plot against Governor Whitmer, that live streamed trial, an execution plot in which the language that they used to refer to her were things like tyrant bitch and saying just grab the bitch. In fact, when I submitted the book, that was the title of the book, was just grab the bitch. So I was planning to, in part because I wanted people to have to say it. It was so overlooked in a lot of the mainstream media coverage. Not everyone, of course. You talked about it, and also Fareed Zakaria talked about it, because I was on his show and I told his booker we should talk about this because other people are not talking about it. And so some people did talk about it, but most people didn't. And in the trial, the defense attorney said, oh, that was just big talk and blowing off steam. And
Right.
so I thought, okay, it's really an opportunity right now to show the public and show the field that actually misogyny and gender-based harms are foundational to all mass shootings in almost every case, and to violent extremism and political violence more broadly.
Yeah, I actually covered the kidnapping and assassination attempt against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, um, right here in Michigan. And while it's on one hand, a very graphic and it is still shocking example of political violence and about the growing violence in the extreme right. Um, I did see so much gendered language against her. This was back in 2020, and Michigan was one of the states that did have some pretty strict health restrictions for the COVID pandemic. And she was governor at the time. She had a Republican legislature with two male Republicans who were the leaders of the House and Senate who clashed with her a lot. They were very close with Donald Trump, very sympathetic to all the people that would come and protest at the Capitol, many of which were bringing semi-automatic rifles, not just outside the Capitol, but into the Capitol during session. They were invited in to the building. And I can say as a journalist, that certainly didn't make me feel any safer.
Yeah.
But that poster that is hard to, it really is hard to look at. But this was not unusual. There were
Right.
so many. I mean, there was a Barbie doll that looked like her that someone was carrying at the protest, where they put a noose on it. A lot of the language that we were hearing from people on the right who were against her COVID policies were frequently referring to her as a bitch or the C word.
Yeah.
And that was not really something that was being covered nationally at all.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder, and we, as you mentioned, there are so many of the mass shooters that we see that have histories of stalking or domestic violence or sexual violence.
Yeah.
And when you talk with experts in this field, like you and with others, it's one of those things like, yes, of course, this is here.
Yeah.
But in the coverage that is, if it's mentioned, it's just in passing.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's just like so much of of the fabric of this country that, we just kind of take it for granted and don't really spend a lot of time talking about it and why.
Yeah, I think there are a couple different things going on that make it more invisible. One, I think, is what you're talking about, which is that it's very much part of the fabric of society. And, and by which I mean, not to say it's all men, right? This is what the way I define misogyny is the way Kate Mann, the philosopher, defines it, which is it's a form of gender policing. It's the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. So sexism is a set of attitudes, misogyny are the actions that go with that to police people and keep them in their place. And that means it's enacted on men as well as women. So when you say to boys, man up, or don't cry, or you play like a girl, that's also kind of an expansive definition of misogyny in its form of gender policing. And it is also enacted, it can be enacted by women on men. It can be enacted on men, and generally, of course, enacted most primarily against women. So on the one hand, it's part of the fabric. I mean, we see that right from childbirth on, that people grow up, and boys in particular are put into these boxes, and that there's often this kind of misogyny that is part of the everyday life that we as women, I have had to look past in order to get things done often. And so I talk about some of those anecdotes right in the book about what it's like to have those comments made by colleagues or whatever, and you just kind of absorb it and move on. So yes, that's true on the one hand, but I think the other problem is that the field itself, interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking, harassment, those things are handled literally by local law enforcement and Department of Justice, right? And they're handled in schools of social work with expertise in women's and gender studies. National security problems, mass violence, terrorism, targeted violence are handled by security agencies and security experts, and never the two twain shall meet, right? Like you just end up with very few conversations. So even if people recognize, I think on the domestic and intimate partner violence side, have been saying this for years, right? So feminist activists, people who work on domestic violence have been saying for years that these connections exist. But the national security side, which has been heavily dominated by men in former law enforcement and military positions, so with their own kind of tighter box around issues of masculinity, have not actually really attended to it. And so I think it's on us to really start to make some of these invisible through lines more visible.
And we do talk about things like toxic masculinity and about the fact that clearly in the last election, a lot of young men shifted to the right. They supported President Trump. But I wanted to talk a little bit about, how these ideas and the online discourse that we have, how is that a pipeline to some of this extremist violence that we've definitely seen an uptick in?
So one of the most common pathways and is a young man who is struggling, and we have to say men and boys are struggling in many ways in this country and elsewhere across the West in particular, with a isolation and loneliness, and also 3/4 of the deaths of despair, which are drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol fueled deaths. Now 40% of college graduates, lower labor market outcomes for traditionally male jobs. So all of those kinds of things are conspiring to create harder situations. Doesn't mean that women are doing better than men, but it means that there's a both and problem, not an either or one. But often you get a young man who goes online and searches for advice on something like fitness or dating or how do I get rich, lands on an influencer, which instead of looking at structural solutions to those very real grievances, is scapegoating someone for the problems that men face. And usually it's feminists and women. And so you get this idea that women's rights have gone too far, feminism has gone too far, and they're taking away your opportunities now. And so that idea of feminism going too far has huge traction now among Gen Z men. More Gen Z men believe that than millennial men or Gen Xer men. So, it's a younger generation who's come to believe that their opportunities, and they've come to believe it because influencers are selling it to them as profiteers and as, making money off of it, to get them to sign up for a course or pay for a subscription or buy a product to be a certain kind of man. And that certain kind of man requires dominance and reassertion and a rejection of the feminine or softer qualities of human life and human capacities.
It's really interesting. And, there seems to be a really big split amongst younger women and men, especially Gen Z, where not just in terms of who they voted for last election, but their ideas on key issues. I I've seen a split, and some of this is anecdotal, but I've also seen some numbers on it where you have younger women are a lot less interested in starting families and having children and getting married, and uh, I than their male counterparts, and that seems to fuel this disconnect because they want very different things. And in the influencer community, it seems like it's really being sold to men as something is being taken away from you.
Yeah.
You're entitled to this, and things were so much better before, and you have to take back your place, and here's how you can do it by buying this, or
Yeah.
here's a
Yeah.
community for you. And where do we go? Because this isn't just a problem for our politics. This is a cultural issue. This is where we're going as a country. And I feel like these issues aren't discussed that much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the first things I would say is we need more spaces to have these conversations. And young men and young women really want those spaces to have these conversations because they feel it quite keenly. And I spend a lot of time in high schools and colleges talking to young men and women and girls and boys, and they often see these things happening. They will ask me things like, girls will say, and young women, like, how are we supposed to date these guys, right? Like, they actually believe that I should be submissive to him, or
Right.
they don't want that, and so, but yet they do want to date men, and so they're like, where are the guys that are genuine egalitarian partners or can be friends? And friendship across sexes has declined as well, and that's something that previous generations had a lot of. And so I had a ton of friends who were guys growing up, and all of a sudden, this younger generation, they just don't really have that anymore. They are living very separate worlds online, and that filters into very separate worlds offline. And so these social divides are also really big. And so, one of the things I think that's really interesting is that the trad wife content, which, you may be
Mhm.
familiar with, right? Which is, content created by women influencers promoting a certain kind of lifestyle. But in some of those big accounts, 80% of the subscribers are men, not women. And
That's
so they're
fascinating.
promoting this supposedly, and there's a lot of talk about how women are, flocking to this trad wife content, but actually it's a lot of men who are, absorbing that kind of fantasy of a submissive life and a submissive wife and a life where they can actually earn enough to be a provider to a family of 8 children or whatever. Like that, these things are also not really possible in the current economic climate, even if both
Right.
parties wanted that, right? It's not, it's a very difficult thing to do, to not have a 2-parent working family, to thrive, and especially in cities.
Yes. And I do find the whole trad wife movement to be fascinating personally.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can get lost in a rabbit hole of videos about churning your own butter and raising your own chickens, and
Yeah.
um, I on camera, everything looks great because
I
we
mean,
don't.
who wouldn't want that,
Right,
right? That
right.
sounds very peaceful, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, nobody on Instagram is filming, the boring parts of life. You edit it down so it all looks
Yeah,
wonderful, whether you're on vacation or,
totally.
whatever your content is. But with that movement, the dynamic that I find fascinating is that in these, in these families that they're pushing these traditional values of women staying at home, clearly they're the breadwinners.
Exactly,
They're
exactly. Yeah,
the some of these content creators are earning fantastic livings as they're saying that women shouldn't work, and so
yeah,
um, obviously that's a contradiction, but within
yeah,
their own lives, I'm curious what the dynamic is with their husbands because
yeah.
they're at the end of the day they're the ones who are affording the lifestyles they can have 8 children.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's one of the things we advise, and I run a research lab called the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL, where we design and test tools and scale them up for communities to help people be more skeptical of the content they consume and not end up being manipulated by profiteers or propagandists or conspiracy theorists or whatever the bad content is. Pedophiles too, right? We do all kinds of things to keep kids safe from, and digital media literacy programs that we have in elementary schools too. So, that work is very rewarding. And I often say I get to work on the best side of the field because you have to map the hard content in order to help people stay aware of it. But we also get to really design and test tools that help communities. And what we find is that some of the most helpful things you can do is point out to people that there's a risk that you're being manipulated. And so you can look at things like, is someone trying to get you to subscribe to something, to pay for content, to buy a product, to sign up for a course? Those types of things, one, are things to be wary of. And also, are you on a platform where the algorithm, as most of them do, prioritize outrageous content that you actually dislike? So some of the algorithms on these platforms will give as much as 5 times the weight to the dislike button as they do to the like button, meaning that you're more likely to get content that like this content if you hit the dislike button, 5 times more likely, because content you dislike keeps you more engaged because you get annoyed by it and outraged, and then you share it with someone. And so actually engagement metrics go up regardless of whether you actually want that content. And so that's a terrible situation, right, for people. But so to be aware of those kinds of dynamics, that you're being peddled outrage as a performance by someone who's trying to profit from you, and trying to understand that dynamic as part of this gender divide and this polarization that we're having. I mean, there's a podcast that accompanies my book that I really encourage folks to listen to called Man Up is the podcast. And in one of the episodes, I interview a teenager who said, or he's a 20-year-old young man, about this, about the gendered content he receives, and why does he think it's so gendered? And he said, clearly there's people out there trying to start a gender war. That's what they want because they can profit from that. And so, politicians can profit from it. Authoritarian and populist leaders can weaponize it. Profiteers can profit from that by selling us products that make us more of a man, supposedly by having a stronger jawline and chewing this stale gum to do that, or whatever it is, right? And influencers can profit by driving subscription metrics and the social media platforms too. So, I think a lot of this is about being skeptical of what we consume, and then understanding how some of these social and political outcomes, including later trajectories to violence, originate in some of these divides that are being packaged and sold to us.
So during the last election, I think there was some coverage of racism, especially with some of the comments that Trump was making about immigrants and his famous "they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats" comment about Haitian immigrants in Ohio, which was just disgusting language. But even before the race became between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, who would have been the first female president, also the first African American female president, Asian American female president, didn't come to pass. But while the race was still between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, I remember there was this Axios article that the Trump campaign strategy was to make this the girls versus boys election.
Yeah.
And with their version of what masculinity was versus, Biden, who was weak and old and therefore feminine, which is bad. And of course, that became a very easy transition once he was actually running against a woman. And so there has been some coverage of how gender dynamics are impacting our politics. How do you see, but I have not seen as much during Trump's actual presidency. So what's kind of your assessment of how his presidency has been in terms of pushing these, traditional gender stereotypes and
Yeah.
his version of masculinity?
I think, we're seeing a couple of different things. One, the normalization and perceived legitimation of gender-based violence is one major thing, right? Right from way back in the first election campaign when I thought there's no way that it's not going to have an impact, that he said on tape, that he was caught on tape saying, when you're a star, they let you grab women by the private parts, right? Like, and it didn't have any effect, right? So like that was the first big red flag. It was like, okay, that we're actually, there might have even, people might have rallied to him because of it, because you hear voters saying things like, well, he says it like it is. He's not afraid to say things that everybody thinks, right? And so then administration officials being appointed who have documented legal histories of domestic violence or of sexual assault or of trials or payments or lawsuits that were settled around sexual assault, are the kinds of things that then lead to also, conversations that say in the mainstream public now from time to time, things like women shouldn't have the right to vote, or women shouldn't be in the military, or, all of these sort of hard won gains over the last century in many ways. And I often say, like, it was 50 years ago, less than 50 years ago, that women in this country got the right to open a bank account or a credit card without a man's signature. It's very easy to forget that was the case. And it wasn't that long ago. It was my mom's generation my mom had 3 kids before she could do that without her dad or her husband's signature. That is it's inconceivable to a younger generation, but it's the kind of thing that, when you start thinking women are less competent, or you start thinking that women should be submissive, or that you should have a head of household vote, or that it's okay because it's in the private sphere to hit your wife and apologize for it and just have it be a private affair that doesn't actually
As the
affect your public
president just said
capacity.
a couple weeks ago.
Yes, right, exactly. Like a little fight shouldn't be a criminal act, right? As Trump said, like a man has a little fight with his wife and we call it a crime. Like these are problems that normalize and legitimize domestic violence. And we know that 60% of mass shooters have a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence. And then even more if you add stalking, harassment, rape threats, sexual assault, anti-LGBTQ issues, right? So like you add all of that in and it's virtually everyone. So if we're normalizing this interpersonal side of things, there's no way that doesn't pan out and create bigger problems for us on the school shooting and mass shooting sides. And then you have families who just sit around. Nobody wants to live in a world where you're worried about your kids getting shot at school. But we're not seeing the mobilization on some of the biggest predictors of it, which are prior histories of gender-based violence and harm.
Right. And actually in Michigan, a few years ago, after we had mass shooting at one of our major universities, Michigan State University, we had several gun control laws finally passed because there was a Democratic legislature and Gretchen Whitmer is still governor there. She's a Democrat. But it was still controversial. One piece of that package, which was trying to take guns out of the hands of domestic abusers.
Yeah.
And that is controversial in the Republican Party. Do you think that kind of stems from this idea of like that's a private matter, and that actually fuels a bigger problem with these, with gun violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's, an incredible reluctance in this country to restrict any Second Amendment rights whatsoever. And so you have that particular problem, although there are now calls to restrict trans people from having access to
I've seen
guns,
that.
right? And so you do see that there's certain areas where you do see suddenly Second Amendment rights could be restricted, which is, unfair based on the data. I mean, fact check in terms of who's actually most at risk of harming someone with a gun. Certainly a domestic violence, documented domestic violence perpetrator would be somebody that's high on that list. But I think one, it's seen as a private problem. It still sits in this world of private interpersonal violence that shouldn't be a public, or is sort of disregarded as a public issue. And then two, I think there's just an incredible reluctance to see any restrictions on Second Amendment rights in a way that like the rest of the world just has a very difficult time wrapping their heads around.
Right. And the data is extremely clear that the U.S. has a gun violence problem unlike any other in the Western world,
Exactly.
and by far.
Yeah.
So I'm curious because you mentioned the trail balloon that the Trump administration put out there about restricting the rights of trans people to have gun ownership. Even though we know the data is very clear that about mass shooters, they're overwhelmingly male and white, and often have this history of gendered violence. In the online world, after there's a mass shooting, there is so much misinformation, and there are usually conspiracy theories, or people are accused of crimes who didn't really commit them. And oftentimes you'll hear conspiracies that it really was a trans person, or, it was a person of color, and somebody gets scapegoated. And then it turns out that the shooter was none of the above, but there are still so many people who believe that.
Yeah.
What do we do in this era where misinformation can be a lot more powerful than the facts on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most perplexing and disturbing things I've seen happen in recent years is this demonization of a tiny percentage of the population, like just a small minority of people turn into campaign ads that said, Kamala is for they, them, Trump is for you, right? So you had this, speaking of like misinformation, it's also misperception. There were surveys around the time of the election showing that Americans in many places felt, when they were asked like what percentage of the population do you think is trans, it was like up to 30%. And the data is like, it's like half of 1%, right? It's a tiny percentage of people. And so one, you had these misperceptions, and two, the idea that there's any threat there whatsoever is also, problematic. And so it's not just how big the percentage of people are, it's also that there is no threat. And so when you look at something like mass shooters, 96 to 98% of them are men, depending on the database you look at. It's just like, why don't we talk about men as the problem? Like I don't mean that like to say that it is all men, but it is the one thing that's almost always there in every mass shooting. And so the few times that there is someone else who is not a man and not a white man, usually in the mass shootings and the terrorist attacks that we have seen recently, or school shootings, then it gets so much attention, right? And then it gets so much attention that there's some sort of call for a policy solution, when actually, what if we were addressing some of these crises with boys and men that lead them to be vulnerable to propaganda that draws them down rabbit holes that can open up scapegoating and the idea that violence against others is some solution to their problems? Because I think that's where we end up. Combined with the fact that some of these shootings are also not ideological at all,
Right.
but they're actually just highly online people who actually sort of lose sight from reality. They either get immersed in mass shooting fandom sites, or they're actually doing things to communicate with some online audience, like inscribing messages on bullets that are basically memes to be seen by somebody else. Ironically, they see themselves as edgelords or sort of meme-based cultures, and they've lost touch entirely. They're gamifying their entire lives, including the violence they enact.
Right. And we've seen with some of the high profile political violence out there, whether, it was the person who shot at Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania last year, or Charlie Kirk's alleged assassin. They don't seem to have like a coherent ideology
Yeah.
that's driving them, but they do seem to be like very online, and
Right.
uh, definitely have been radicalized just, in terms of violence.
Right.
Um, and so I'm wondering, I know you study this, and this is your life's work, but what do we do about the fact that it is so easy to fall down those rabbit holes
Yeah.
online?
Well, one, I think we have to make a concerted effort at every level, and this is not waiting for the government to solve this or social media companies to solve it, but working in education and in families and on the soccer field to reduce the growing support that a younger generation in particular has for political violence and their willingness to engage in it. So, the most recent numbers I've seen are 56% of Gen Z think that violence is acceptable under some circumstances. And I think that's hugely problematic because we're either seeing that or we're seeing apathy in reaction to a large failure of real adults to show them that dialogue can work, right? So we haven't really modeled this very well for a younger generation, and they're either tired of it and checking out entirely, or they're starting to think like, well, okay, whether it's climate change or immigration reform, you may have to have revolution to get change to actually
Mhm.
happen when they are engaged. And I think one, we have to de-escalate that as concertedly as we can. I think that's one thing we have to do. We also have to I do think that there's something to be said for cell phone bans in schools. I do think some time away from online spaces is helpful, but I don't think that's a solution in the absence of conversations with kids about what they're seeing online and how often violent content comes across their feeds that they didn't ask for. And so that kind of problem of the desensitization to violence and how that can open up a fascination with gore or with
Mhm.
mass shooter fandom cultures and a desire to have some sort of infamy, right? To rest in infamy or communicate back with your online community, I think are all problematic. And so it helps to have less time online, but not if you're not also talking to your kids about what they saw in the hallway on their friend's phone or in the recess or after school. It's not a total protection to have less time online if kids still don't have any place to process what they've seen.
Yeah. Um, at what age do you think these conversations need to start happening?
I mean, it's really clear in the data that like age 11 to 14 is one of the riskiest periods of time online in terms of starting to get introduced to these ideas and becoming kind of more politically conscious at that time. So I would urge everyone to do it before 11. Ideally, you're having these conversations from the beginning, from the first time kids have tablets to have conversations with them about what happens. There's user generated content on almost any site on YouTube Kids, right? That can splice. So on this podcast that I did, one of the interviewees, a teenager, 18-year-old girl, was saying how when she was 2, she was watching like inappropriate Dora, is what she called it, without realizing she was watching inappropriate Dora. It was Dora videos that were spliced with like racist content and inappropriate content. And her grandfather overheard it and said, "Hey, what are you watching?" But her parents hadn't realized it because they had their hands full with an older child, and they thought she was just watching Dora. And so I think there's, from the very beginning, have conversations and monitor and know what kids are watching, but also have conversations that allow them to come and make sure there's a safe place that is not going to be full of judgment and shame, that is, to say, "Hey, I saw this." I mean, she herself in this interview says she saw something terrible once by accident in sixth grade involving sexual content with an animal. And she did not tell her parents because she knew they'd take away her phone. And it just had popped up on her phone.
Mm.
Um, and she didn't know what to do and ended up in therapy. But like, her fear was she's going to lose her phone if she admits that this happened. And so I think finding ways to have kids have places where they can report and have conversations about what they've seen without necessarily their feeling like they have to censor that because they're going to lose access to their technology and their ways of communicating with their friends that they do really cherish is really important.
So right now, I know that there are a lot of women who feel very angry as far as, our basic rights have been taken away with Roe v. Wade being overturned. And yet again, there was an election where a woman was not elected president, and we are often being targeted by this administration for different policies. And it doesn't really feel, I think, to most women that I talk with, that we're winning right now, that we have too many rights. At the same time, you have a lot of men, especially younger men, who do feel like something's been taken away. They're not graduating from college at the same rates as women. Obviously, the economy has been difficult for a lot of young people, and we know that the economy is not really getting any better at this point. So where do you feel like we are going right now in terms of gender relations in this country, and what's the solution in trying to bridge the gap into something that works for everybody, where, you know, women have rights, men feel like they have opportunities, and there isn't this gender war going on?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think this is one of the fundamental divides of our society. And in the future sort of decade or two, we're going to continue to see these spill on effects of lack of trust, lack of friendships that might provide other perspectives, our lack of ability to have these conversations across gender or sex lines. And the way that's spilling over into dating, interpersonal relationships, but also the kind of weaponization of it, of those divides by politicians who position gender and gendered social changes as sort of morally wrong and undermining the tradition of the nation. And so one of the things you see in like Hungary, for example, when Orban went after Central European University, the first thing he did was shut down gender studies and women's studies departments. And that university eventually had to flee and go, and Austria offered it a spot. And we saw that with New College of Florida, that women's studies, gender studies, the so-called attacks on DEI are embedded in some of these same kinds of conversations about somehow gender being dangerous, right? Conversations about gender being dangerous to the fabric of the nation or to traditions. And so I think, one, we have to not fall for that, right? We have to be willing to have these open conversations, even if we disagree on them, and have conversations about what does it mean? What is the range of things that are happening among a younger generation that might be driving some of this content. So that's one thing. And the other thing, I do think I recognize that feeling of feeling disillusioned and tired and disappointed. And I would say, there's an epilogue in my book that my editor encouraged me to include, which is called my "Oh Sorry Ma'am" era. And it's like one of the most hilarious things that's ever happened to me. It was recently, I was jogging in my neighborhood and I got catcalled from behind. And when I turned around to look at the guy, he threw up both his hands and stepped back after he saw my face, like how old I am. And it was like, "Oh, sorry, ma'am." Right? Like, right, exactly. Everyone I know laughs like crazy at that, right? Because it's like, he wasn't apologizing for catcalling. He was
Mhm.
apologizing for catcalling someone who's presumably old enough to be his mother. And so, I use that example to say, like, maybe that's why I could write a book like this now, because now I'm aging into this age that some women call it the age of invisibility, or where you suddenly get less attention on the streets. You're less sexualized to some extent, objectified to some extent. And so, but that doesn't mean it's not happening anymore. It's happening to a younger generation just as much. He would have catcalled my daughter without apologizing, but me, he has to say, say, "Oh, sorry, ma'am." I even got the "ma'am," right? This like little word of respect, right?
Right,
And
right.
so, like, it was a ridiculous and hilarious anecdote, but to me it also signals like this is a call to action for women of an age who can continue to fight on behalf of younger generations of women who are the ones, young women and queer people most affected by these suppressive policies and by the loss of rights. And so I do think it's on us to do it. And it's on men too, right? To step up. And it's not just a call to women, it's a call to everyone to model different behavior, to learn how to raise children in a way that produces outcomes that encourage open conversation and discussion around these and don't force people into boxes, including our boys and men.
Cynthia, thank you so much for being here. I want us to put your book up again so that people know what to look for in their favorite bookstores. It's Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. It's such an important book right now, and I really appreciate you coming on to talk with us about it.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues with you.
Thank you for being here.